Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for coming to watch my presentation. My name is Masaru Yamamoto, and I'm a PhD student at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver in Canada. So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So the title of my presentation is Multimodal Academic Discourse Socialization, an ethnographic case study of geoscience students' poster presentations. So this is part of my MA thesis, where I examined how students learn to think, view, and communicate as geoscientists through recurrent multimodal classroom practices, and how those multimodal classroom practices manifest in students' moment-to-moment interaction in the poster presentation. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so now let me screen share a bit. Now let's move on to introduction. So in university context, students need to understand and successfully perform a range of academic tasks, both inside, outside, and computer-mediated asynchronous and synchronous classroom environments. And research has shown that this is way more complex than we might generally conceive. Many researchers are now increasingly interested in exploring the affordances, complexity, and challenges of this process under the umbrella term called academic discourse socialization, which is called ADS. According to Kobayashi et al. 2017, ADS is concerned with university students' lived experiences in gaining necessary dispositions and learn to perform meaningful actions in institutionally and socioculturally valued ways as they participate in their disciplinary community. As the also defines, this process is dynamic, situated, and often multimodal. Traditionally, researchers are interested more in how students learn to speak and write. Now, there are two overlapping research gaps in ADS research. First, despite the definition that ADS is multimodal according to Duff, this aspect remains secondary to spoken and written language. That means that little attention has been paid to visual, embodied, and other non-linguistic dimensions. Indeed, Kanagaraja and his colleagues' research on international STEM scholars clearly show that language does not always take precedence in their scientific communication, in lectures, or even in scientific publications. So, language is just a part of the whole meaning-making practices in a situated social environment, and we do need to extend our research attention. Second, the type of academic tasks. While lecture-type presentations has been extensively studied, little attention has been paid to poster presentations, a prevalent multimodal academic task in professional conferences like AAL and educational contexts. So, I focus on these two research gaps by asking this research question. How do students use multimodal resources to perform poster presentation according to the values and norms of the geoscience course and those of the broader discipline? Now, I'm going to talk briefly about the theoretical framework. Theoretically and methodologically, this study has been guided by language socialization, Vygotskian sociocultural theory, and Van Leer's ecological approach. In the interest of time, I talk only about some of the commonalities and important aspects of those theories. So collectively, those theories take sociocultural orientation to learning, viewing learning as doing, belonging, becoming, and experiencing through participation rather than acquisition or accumulation of knowledge. Here, participation in symbolically and materially mediated interaction is the locus of language use, and by extension, development and learning. Novices are assumed to learn through language and learn to use language in and through participation in social interaction. Therefore, in a traditional sense, language is seen as a primary means and ends of learning. More recently, however, theorists began to acknowledge the significance of non-linguistic resources in the learning of language and the subject knowledge. So there are two important points here. The first is about language socialization. Language socialization places more emphasis on socio-cultural aspects of learning, including gaining communicative competence, membership, identity, and legitimacy that are necessary for meaningful participation in the target community. For this reason, it takes into account multiple levels of scales, ranging from micro-interactional, meso-institutional, and macro-ideological levels. Second, Van Leer's ecological approach sees social interaction and learning as semiotic, situated meaning-making practices. The environment offers affordances or action potential for individuals as they interact with and act upon the physical and social environment. For this reason, Van Leer argued that social interaction is essentially triadic, mediated not only by individuals' linguistic actions, but also by a range of embodied and multimodal affordances available in the environment. Here, it should be noted that the environment here is not only about the immediate social interactional context, but also broader institutional and sociocultural and disciplinary environments. Now let's move on to methodology. So to conduct this research, I chose to employ an ethnographic multiple case study. Case study was chosen to gain an in-depth understanding of the phenomena of interest, in my case multimodal ADS, that was inseparable from its social context. Here, the case of the study was the geoscience course, in which 4 focal students were selected as focal cases. Therefore, this study presents the nesting of cases. This study was also ethnographic in order to understand the meaning of multimodal practices from a disciplinary insider's perspective. In other words, my goal was to gain emic and ethic perspectives. This slide shows you a bit of contextual information about the research site. The course I looked at was called EPS 251, which stands for Earth and Planetary Science. This particular course emphasizes the process over content. That is, the course was designed to develop students' academic skills and critical thinking skills, such as scientific, inductive reasoning. This course was also selected as a research site because it involved a poster presentation as its course assignment, and instructors' and students' consent was available. So this slide shows you participant information and case selection processes. Today, we will look at 2 of my focal participants, Jack and Rachel, as you can see at the bottom left corner, who are L1 Mandarin international students from China. I utilized multiple data, including class observations, interviews, and cultural artifacts like documents. I also recorded videos of poster presentations. My data analysis involved 2 phases. So those data are first semantically analyzed iteratively to further guide my multimodal interaction analysis of students' poster presentations in order to examine how students' disciplinary classroom practices are instantiated in moment-to-moment interaction from disciplinary insider's emic perspective. And this slide shows you how the first phase of my data analysis looked like. And this slide shows you what my multimodal interaction analysis entailed. I used a software called ELAM to assist my multimodal transcriptions and analysis. I transcribed or annotated the items on the left column. Now, I will talk about the classroom ethnography part of my research. Now, I'll talk a little bit about a recurrent multimodal classroom activity called observations and interpretations. At the beginning of each class, Robert, the instructor, showed the visual image and asked his students to make observations in small groups and then as a whole class. So those are kind of 2-staged activities. After that, Robert asked his students to make interpretations of the image, first in small groups and then whole class. The first phase was called observations. My class observations and interview data suggest that students were expected to specifically find geological patterns in the activity and remain completely descriptive, without making any speculations about the image, as you can see here. To do so, students made use of spoken and gestural diacritics, that is, pointing gesture in combination with demonstrative pronouns spoken, such as this and that, when they make observations. The second phase was called interpretations. Here, students were expected to think about and communicate their hypotheses about what they're seeing. I mean the patterns, and possible geological processes that might have caused the observable pattern and features. To interpret, students use their early observations and other kinds of knowledge synthetically to generate their hypotheses. Students actively embody those practices. Importantly, students were expected and socialized to think about what is called scales in this process, and those are some of the images that was used for this activity. So scales. Scales were considered as important observational device. When they make observations and interpretations, students were implicitly and often explicitly socialized to think about scales as a crucial aspect of thinking, viewing, observing as geoscientists. One of the TAs in the course described the scale as an important observational device to provide context for visually well-grounded observations and interpretations. This is an example of human scale that was purposefully backgrounded in relation to the massive size of the geological feature. Here, students were inclined to think about the relative size of the geological features in comparison with humans, who are much smaller than the geological feature here. So keeping those findings in mind, let's move on to the analysis of students' poster presentations. But before that, I'll briefly explain how the geoscience poster template constituted an important aspect of multimodal ADS. So this was provided by Robert in PowerPoint file, and this geoscience poster template explicitly required inclusion of at least 2 visual components. So the first visual was called Figure 1. Students were required to put a data set that shows an interesting pattern in it. In other words, the visual was intended to facilitate presenters' and viewers' observations. The second visual is called model. The model was used to build understanding the pattern in the data. In other words, this was used to make interpretations of geoscientific processes that cause the pattern shown in Figure 1. Lastly, the title of the poster was a research question. Importantly, the research question had to be motivated by the pattern in Figure 1. Here, students were encouraged to redesign the poster template to meet their own specific needs and content while maintaining the basic components and organizational structure. So this is a geoscience poster created by Jack and Rachel, where they talked about the reasons for uneven ozone distributions. They talk about 2 things: a data set that shows interesting ozone distribution pattern, and a model that provides visual explanations for the observable pattern. The research question, why the ozone layer is thinner at the tropics than the poles, is motivated by the Figure 1 and is answerable by the model. The next expert focuses on Jack, who explains interesting observable patterns in the data set, and Rachel, who explains why there's a hole in the ozone layer in the South Pole, drawing on the visual model, as you can see on the right-hand side. So in line 2, when he said, "We found a pattern that ozone layer," he extended his right arm in front of Figure 1 in his attempt to draw his viewers' attention. He then quickly moved his right pointing finger down to the color scale and said, "As you can see." Here, even though the referent was missing in his spoken utterance, it was clear to the audience that Jack was making reference to the color scale because of his coordinated spoken and gestural reference. An important thing here is that he first made a reference to color scale before talking about the patterns. It is presumably because without knowing the contextual meaning of the color, the viewer cannot really understand what the map communicates. So the viewers might ask what the red or blue means in this map, or something like that. He then began to describe the pattern, starting from the ozone-dense area as in picture 4 and 5, and then blue areas where ozone is thin, as in picture 6. Here, Jack produces narrower and then wider pinching gesture in front of the red upper right area as in picture 4, and then along the equator as in picture 6, so that's wider here. This suggests that not only did Jack dialectically point to the patterns in the image, but he also represented the width referenced patterns in his multimodal explanation. Likewise here, when he referenced the ozone depletion in the South Pole, he circled the area with his right index finger as in picture 8. This movement was concurrent with his spoken utterance, "a depletion," that means a hole. This further suggests that when he pointed to a specific pattern, he also represented the shape of the referent in his multimodal explanation. To sum up, the coordinated use of spoken utterances, gestures, and visuals was an important aspect of scientific communication in the poster presentation context. So we will look at Rachel, who explains atmospheric and geological processes that created a big ozone hole in the South Pole. So she first recapitulates her observations as indicated in yellow, and then poses a question to the audience as shown in pink. Why this pattern happens? She's explaining how harmful pollutants were brought to the poles. In so doing, she made reference to an atmospheric model as in picture 3 by extending her right arm. In this atmospheric model, you can see many divergent white arrows that represent the outward flow of the air. So warmer air goes up in the middle, gets pushed to the periphery, and then sink in the peripheral areas in the atmosphere. So to explain this, Rachel first folded both of her hands inwardly in front of her chest, and then released them to the two opposite directions simultaneously. This call occurred with her utterance. It's pushed by the atmosphere to the two poles, as indicated in pink in lines 10 and 11. So this suggests that Rachel attempted to represent the atmospheric process of pushing through her iconic embodiment. So her body movement was in alignment with the model she previously mentioned, in that both demonstrate divergent outward movement of the air. In the interest of time, I just briefly explain what Rachel did in her contiguous utterance. She first recapitulates her observation, making reference to the ozone depletion, as in lines 13 and 15. And then she bodily explained the geological and atmospheric processes by producing the vertical hand movement, as in picture 6, and then circular movement, as in picture 7 and 9. So to summarize, these synchronized multimodal resources not only facilitated communication about complex geological and atmospheric process and phenomena, but also constituted essential elements of geoscience knowledge, practice, and discourses that students are being socialized into. So let's talk about conclusions. So in conclusion, students coordinated multimodal and embodied resources in moment-to-moment interaction. In my thesis, I also found that those practices were tightly linked to institutional practice at meso level, and by extension, to the norms and values of the disciplinary community at macro levels. Because of the time, I cannot talk about implications, but please do hit the pause button and take a look at them in this slide and the next slide. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge and express my sincere gratitude for the people you see here and countless many others for the tremendous support in making my first triple presentation possible. That's all for today. So thank you once again for coming to watch my presentation. And if you have any questions or comments or something like that, you can always email me or post questions somewhere in the platform. Thank you. ありがとうございました。